Welcome to the System Simplified podcast, where we feature top leaders who share stories on how to successfully systemize a business. Now, let's get started with the show.
Hello, Adi Klevit here with the System Simplified podcast, where we interview top entrepreneurs, founders, and thought leaders about systematizing a business. And this podcast is being brought to you by Business Success Consulting Group. At Business Success Consulting Group, we create custom processes and tailor-made business systems so businesses can thrive and grow. And today's guest is Jay Bartot. Hi, Jay.
Hi, Adi.
Great to have you on the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I am so excited because today we are going to talk about the relationship between data and processes and why processes are so important. And I'm just excited to have you as a guest. So for our speaker, our listeners, so I'm going to introduce you. So you are the CEO and co-founder of a Seattle-based company, which is Zeitworks. It's an AI-powered business process intelligence platform that provides enterprises with the data-driven insights and tools they need to continuously improve and transform their business process operations. So it's basically using data and analysis and using artificial intelligence, AI, in order to figure out how to continuously improve processes. So that's going to be a great conversation. But, Jay, you are, as you wrote in your bio, you have over 20 plus years of experience being an entrepreneur, innovator, and you have experience in developing data and machine learning applications for a variety of verticals. You work in e-commerce, online advertising, travel, medical informatics, consumer video creation. So definitely a vast experience along many verticals in, again, creating that, developing the applications and processes based on data and learning. So anything else you would like to share with us about your background and your experience?
Sure, yeah. I always like to say I'm a sucker for a good problem. And I worked in all those verticals you mentioned. I didn't plan on doing that. Like a lot of people, I probably could have spent my time in one of those single verticals. But I was always looking for a good problem, as I said, a problem where I could utilize interesting data, sometimes proprietary data or data that's hard to come by. And then applying analytics and machine learning to it in order to provide some kind of transparency into some situation where there was no transparency. So you mentioned online advertising, for example. I co-founded a company in the late 90s where we were the first people to measure online advertising. No one had done that before. There were lots of ads running on the newly found web, but nobody knew what ads were running where and how much. And with that transparency, opened up a whole bunch of opportunities for advertisers and the ad networks alike. Another example, probably my favorite, is a travel company I co-founded called Faircast. And at Faircast, we predicted changes in airfare prices. And so, most of us travel frequently, and we know that when we look at prices for particular routes, Seattle to Boston, on such and such date, we might notice that the price is different every time we look. And the reason is because airlines use revenue management systems to sell the right product to the right person at the right time. And so we use machine learning technology and a lot of airfare pricing data to figure out, is the price going to go up in the near future or is it going to go down? And if it's going to go down, then you might want to wait to buy your ticket till the optimal time. So those are, I think, both good examples of where, for consumers or for businesses, there was no transparency into a system. And we used data and analytics and machine learning to provide transparency.
That's great. So, we talked about processes before the show. We talked about processes, and Zeitworks is all of your company that you founded and you are the CEO of now. It's all about figuring out gathering data to figure out the efficiency of the different processes, right? In order to give transparency to create that continual improvement.
Yeah.
So tell us about the correlation between data analysis, and process improvement?
Sure. Similar to what I was saying earlier about transparency, when I was at Madrona Venture Labs, a colleague of mine, co-founder actually, Ben Elowitz, and I were looking at the automation space. And it was an exciting time for RPA companies and so forth. And so in our usual fashion of research, we were talking to lots of different players, whether they're automation technology companies or consultants or actual customers. And what we learned is that more often than not, an organization who has an operations team that run repetitive business processes, more often than not, they don't have insight or transparency into what's really going on with the team and the processes. And so they may only have a sense of what the actual steps in the process are, or they may not really understand who their best performers are in their team, or whose behaviors exhibit, optimal productivity. And so to me, looking at the world through the lenses I've looked at with a lot of my other businesses, this was a data and transparency problem. And so the key was, okay, well, what's the data? And in our case with Zeitworks, we realized that the data was going to be collected from the desktop machines of the SMEs or agents performing the repetitive business processes. And this software would observe how these folks interacted with their applications as they performed their business processes. And so we get all kinds of low-level, interesting, sometimes noisy, cumbersome data from this desktop software that gives us indications of how people are interacting with, say, Salesforce or Microsoft Word or Excel, any application they use as part of the process. So our software really creates this data at the source. It sends all that data continuously back to our machine learning cloud, where we use the latest technologies to make sense of the data. Data is data, right? It's usually not very interesting in its raw form. Especially real-world data can be really noisy and problematic in all kinds of ways. The real value comes when you apply technology to the data to figure out, okay, what's actually going on here, and not only what's going on here, but what do I do with this data? How do I use this data to transform my business, in this case, or any other kind of application?
For sure, that is a really good point in terms of what are you doing with the data? Because we hear about keeping data, having KPIs, having metrics, which are very important, but you can also keep the wrong data, or you can have the raw data, but looking at it in a way that is not going to benefit you in making decisions, right? So what are some questions that business owners should ask in terms of, so they can figure out how useful is the data and where is it useful?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, what's hard a lot of times is that context really matters. And so there may be a business leader who knows their business. They may know their employees. They may know a lot of information about how the work is done. And so taking data in various forms and various resolutions and knowing what to do with it can be, contextually dependent. So, for example, we get a lot of, Zeitworks collects a lot of low-level data on how people interact with Excel. Excel's kind of ubiquitous. We see it quite a bit in these repetitive business processes. It's oftentimes the glue that kind of pieces together other parts of the process or moves data between applications. And so we're able to see what files and what sheets and what cells people are interacting with. And so in that case, the format of the Excel sheet is probably very specific to the process in the business. And so it's not so obvious what to do with that data unless you've created that spreadsheet and okay, I'm going to change the format of it, or I'm going to make it more restrictive in terms of who can edit which cells or which sheets so that, things don't go off the rails. Other situations are not so contextual, like being able to compare employee performance and behaviors across the whole team and see, who's actually more productive, and what are their behaviors, compared to the rest of the team is something that kind of falls out naturally no matter what the business process is.
Right. So you can use the data in order to evaluate the performance of the person themselves, or you can evaluate the comparison between people and how they work. Like, so who is effective, who is not, once you have the process defined, or even when it's not defined, you can just use it in order to measure the output. And that it also can help you with determine capacity, right? Because if you can see how much one person can do compared to another, and then you can see how to improve the process or training, or is it a personality, or whatever changes you have to make there, so that person that is not producing as much as the other one can improve, then it also affects your capacity.
Yeah. And, the discovery and analysis is usually an iterative process. It's interesting for me to see our customers interacting with the data for the first time. This is the first time they've seen into, a box that was black, but now it's translucent, and you can sort of see in and see what's going on. And oftentimes there's sort of an astonishment of like, oh no, this can't be right. That couldn't be the case. And then we go back and we patiently explain how we arrived at the data, and so then we sort of get them past that hump. And then what usually really stands out next is the variance in behavior across the team. And so I've got a whole team processing, say, business loan applications. And yet, if I look across application usage on the team for that same process, you see a lot of variance. And so it's really interesting in that, people, humans, and processes are inextricably tied. You really can't have one without the other in terms of our world at Zeitworks. And seeing how much people's behavior can vary sort of starts to really open up the aha moments. Like, wow, why is this person using Teams so much? Or why is this person spending so much time in Excel compared to the rest of the team? And, that's where I think typically people just start gathering more questions and want more answers. And so our product allows the ability to start at a high level, get an analytics landscape of what's going on, but then be able to drill into details as they find more and more kind of peculiar, strange things that they're curious about.
Yeah, for sure. So what are some of the changes that you see companies make once they have transparency to the data, and how long does it take to create or to execute each part of the process, and any changes that are needed? So what do you usually see?
Yeah, we see a lot of things. It depends on the customer. You mentioned additional training is often the case. We had one customer tell us that they don't really know till 4 to 6 weeks into an employee's tenure whether they've been trained properly. And so our data can help reveal whether further training is needed. Staying on training, we have another customer who actually conducts regular training sessions, mandatory monthly training sessions, but they're not always sure what material to cover. And so, our technology and data gives them insights into, let's talk about this week because, we see people doing this instead of that. And, let's talk about the right way to do this. Other times there's processes that need to be re-engineered, particularly at certain parts where there's bottlenecks. Time that's large amounts of time that are being spent on a particular step of the process, especially if there's variance across the team, then that can indicate that we might want to rethink this. Still others are behavioral traits. We have a metric we call context switching, which measures how people thrash back and forth between applications. So someone might be in one application, go to another application, and then quickly switch back. And do that a lot repetitively.
Why would they do that?
It could be habit. It could be that the application they go to really quickly has some piece of information that they need to keep referring back to. But all of those context switching is really inefficient. And it's, as I like to say, it's kind of like death by 1,000 cuts. These little things add up over time. And so by being able to point this out either at a team level or an individual level can really give insight into why some people are more productive than others.
Yeah.
One more thing that we see, and that is that there's actually a system that's being refactored or redesigned. So we have a number of Salesforce customers, and we have some deep expertise in Salesforce and Salesforce data. And we have some customers that we're helping essentially understand the current usage of their Salesforce platform as the system of record for their business processes to inform how they're going to rebuild Salesforce in the process. Since the process is so Salesforce-centric, they really want to know what applications are they interacting with, what Salesforce objects they're interacting with, so that can inform the building of the new bridge, if you will.
Right. So that basically, I think that is a great way to utilize the software. Is like when you are implementing a new application or implementing a new software and you want to know how it's working in terms of the training, but in terms of also the output, because you made some change in order to create, to acquire or to get a certain output, so you want to make sure that that actually works. So that makes sense.
Yeah.
So in general, Jay, why do you think processes are so important to a business?
Well, gosh, they're ubiquitous, and I've been astonished since the beginning of Zeitworks. I continue to be astonished how many business processes are out there. Every once in a while you hear about AI, and AI is going to replace all the jobs, and people are going to be out of work, and all these kinds of things. I don't have any worry about that. I don't think humans are going anywhere. And in fact, if we can understand the processes that they do and find the grunt work parts, the parts that are unpleasant for humans, and replace those with bits of automation technology, then the human can, do more cognitively significant things, if you will. But the AI technology is way off from being able to, do the job of most processes and most humans. There are some simple ones, sure, that automation technology can be very good with, but most of them are still fairly complex, even if they have a repetitive aspect to them. There's a document as part of the process that an SME or an agent needs to look at and evaluate. And decide, is this a document that I should do X with or I should do Y with? As I said, computers are getting there, but they're still a ways off. And so, understanding these things, I think, ultimately provides opportunity to make everything more efficient and pleasant for everybody involved.
I agree. So it's basically what you're saying from our conversation today is, you have to have business processes, but then also evaluate them by measuring, by tying your data to the process, right? So not just for the end result of the process. So let's say you have a process of making widgets. So then obviously you count the number of widgets that you are making that are actually coming out of the production line correctly without any defects, high quality. You can actually sell them, you can actually transport them, and they're fine. You don't have to reproduce them, do them again or fix them. So that would be like the measuring of the output. And that the process is working if you actually have a certain benchmark, if you're meeting the certain benchmarks that you have to make sure that you actually measuring or getting the output that you want. But how do you get to what's the maximum? Let's say, you realize that you want to make 80 widgets, but maybe that production line, and we're talking also about service industry, so it's not just the production line, not just an example of a production line. Sure. Maybe you can actually do 90. Maybe right now you're doing 80 because you have bottlenecks along the process, right? So you have to use data. You have to have data in order to analyze the process and the efficiency of the process. And that's basically how you shine the light on the process to make sure that you have the data to make the right decision.
Yeah. And, I'm always talking about how Zeitworks is a continuous improvement system. So the first look at the data is shining a light through the black box and saying, okay, I sort of see what's going on here. But then the work is really only beginning at that point. From there, you want to set a benchmark and say, okay, well, for better or for worse, here's where we are. But I have some hypotheses already about what I should change. And so I'm going to take a systematic approach to making these changes and using that continuous data collection from a system like Zeitworks, to ultimately see if the ROI on my changes, are reaping benefits and fruit.
Right.
So that's a really important part, I think, is that just because you can see what's going on doesn't mean that's the end of the story. There's great bodies of work and really skilled professionals out there who use things like Lean and Six Sigma and other improvement methodologies to set those benchmarks, create those hypotheses, and then iterate and rinse and repeat.
Great. All right. So basically, it's definitely a very insightful conversation in terms of figuring out that if you want to improve your process, you have to have data to figure out where that process can be improved. Mm-hmm. And even if you don't have access, you think, well, I don't have data. How do I get to the data? You can always use a system to get to the data. And that's basically what you created with Zeitworks. But let's say you have a smaller business, you're not an enterprise, you still need to go and figure out how you're going to get the data in order to measure the productivity, how you're going to get the data in order to measure the how efficient the process is, and where do you have to take measures in order to improve the process.
Yeah. Well, it was interesting for us to learn that for years, time and motion studies and other observational studies were used, are still used by consultants and business process experts, to gather some data, albeit manually from manual observation, to be able to do these iterative improvements. And, if you're a small business, can't afford, fancier technology platforms and consultants and so forth, then I think that any kind of measurement can be helpful. Ideally, people's work is not interrupted because if people have to stop and write things down and those kinds of things, then that can cut into productivity. But having the mindset of a data-driven mindset, I think, is really sort of the key to whatever kind of solution you gravitate towards, whether it be a technology solution or just more of a hands-on iterative approach. That seems to be the big barrier in a lot of the corporate world, is really sort of understanding what a data-driven mindset is and adopting it and sticking to it.
Absolutely. And I think it's also true for small businesses, small, medium-sized businesses, because the question that I'm being asked a lot is how can we ensure that the processes are being followed by all? We are very good at documenting and creating the playbooks, but now how do we ensure that the processes are followed by all? Yeah. So there are different methods of doing it. I mean, you have to make it accessible. You have to put it on a platform that everybody can have access to and read it. I mean, the first thing is to have to understand the process and read it. Mm-hmm. But you also have to have some kind of a data measurement to show that the processes are, if the processes are being done and you're getting the data that you need, I mean, you basically measure it by the data, then it's fine. The processes are working. But when it's not working and you can show objective measurements that it's not, that is where you can encourage people to follow the processes and then see the difference by the measurement of the data.
Yeah. And it can be tricky too, because, humans they're funny beings. We have a tendency to drift and sort of want to do our own thing and fall into what feels natural to us. And there's probably a lot of times where there may be a defined process, but an individual on a team finds a better way just through experimentation. And so, if possible, that those discoveries, whether they were deliberate or by accident, would not be thrown out, if you will. That someone figuring out a better way for this part of the process. Hey, I found I could do this even quicker at this step by doing X, Y, and Z. If you can retain that knowledge and factor that back into the original design, it seems like that's ideal.
I think so too. If it's measured, if you measure it by data, if you have data to prove it, right? Because then it's not just this vague idea that this is better or not better. It's just like, oh, we actually created an improvement by such and such. It's very quantified, and then you can basically justify that for sure.
And who better to find optimizations than the people actually doing the work? they're down in the weeds and running the processes. And, humans are great pattern recognition finders. We're really good at zeroing in on where the patterns. And so, I think a lot of good things can come from that.
I think so too. Well, Jay, that has been a great conversation with a lot of data. So can you tell our listeners how they can get a hold of you if they have a question, or your website?
Sure. Yeah. Thanks. Our website is www.zeitworks.com, Zeitworks. There's lots of information there about our system and how it works, and also a number of different ways you can reach out to us and contact us. You can request a demo. You can talk to sales. You can talk to our security team. Wherever you want to start, just reach out to us.
Excellent. And of course, this podcast would not be complete without giving a big shout out to Russell Ben-Arroyo, who introduced us. So thank you, Russell, for the introduction.
Thanks, Russell.
And thank you so much, Jay, for being a guest on this podcast and sharing all those insights.
Thanks for having me, Adi. Great to talk to you.
Thanks for listening to the System Simplified podcast. We'll see you again next time, and be sure to click subscribe to get future episodes.